Our first guest this morning. So good morning to you, the Conservative former Chancellor, former Home Secretary, I could go on, but we've only got an hour. So hello to Ken Clarke. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for cutting out the CV, John. Good morning. How are you?
It's good to talk to you. Before we talk, Ken, about the bigger picture of the European Union, there's a lot to talk about there. The idea that there could soon be a space where Britain used to be. It takes a lot to frighten you, Ken. You've been around the block more than a few times. Are you frightened about the idea of Greece being made effectively bankrupt because it won't cut its spending enough, and the bailouts dry up so it can't pay back its creditors, and it's evicted from the euro, and that's the beginning of the breakup of the Eurozone? Should the rest of us, are you frightened about that?
Well, it's really got to be taken seriously. I mean, I've thought for quite some time now that it's inevitable that Greece is going to default on its debt. There's obviously, the Greeks have elected a government that isn't going to be bailed out for another time. They've been bailed out twice already, and they'll be back in 6 months if you just bail them out without any reforms to give the Greeks a competitive economy. Now, we've had enough time, but I think it's been going on, is time has been spent on minimising the consequences for everybody else. I mean, there are British banks exposed there and so on, and every other people have exposure there, but things are a lot better than they were 2 years ago, and I hope the finance ministers, who will be trying to talk sense to the Greeks tomorrow, but I hope they're also together with the central bank, have worked out how to minimise the consequences. The other thing I'm a bit more worried about is how to work out the consequences for the Greek people, because I like Greece, I like Greek people. They've failed in the first duty of an electorate, which is to elect a competent government. They've got a lot of 1960s trots in charge who seem, rather amateurish. But what we obviously, nobody wants to see the Greeks reduced to poverty, but someone's got to protect the general public insofar as they can, whilst trying to get them face to face with reality. You can't, if you won't pay taxes to pay for bloated public services, you can't expect the taxpayers of every other Eurozone country to keep paying for it.
I should warn you, Ken, that the editor of this programme today is of Greek extraction. He's threatening to cut you off if you carry on talking like that about the Greek electorate.
I think their voting pattern has been, they didn't vote for very good governments before, but this lot put the tin lid on it. But in every other way, no, I just said I like Greece. It's a sort of marvellous country, and Greeks are very nice people. I have no hang-up about Greeks. I'm very sorry that they're in this really dreadful crisis.
Yeah. I mean, it's also got to be said that their creditors handed them an enormously heavy line of credit for a very long time indeed, knowing
I don't know
the
why.
creditworthiness of the Greek economy.
Well, I give up with the market sometimes. People manage other people's money, and the sort of fund managers and so on, and anybody who lent money to a Greek government at German interest rates needed their head examining. The difficulty is you have to protect the rest of the financial markets, and you have to protect the Greek people from the consequences of really several years of folly.
I want to talk about the wider picture, as I say, just in just a minute, but another dimension to all of this, if Greece defaults, as you think is going to happen, and if it ends up, effectively bankrupt, the suggestion, the fear, is that China and Russia are both there, ready to pour in with investment, with support, and suddenly you have Greece within the orbit, not directly, obviously, but beholden to Russia and China. Is that not a strategic worry?
I think they'll try to exploit it. I mean, anything that divides up the European Union is a great boon to Mr. Putin, but he can't afford it. He's already got the sort of rather disastrously poor and industrially spent eastern Ukraine to prop up. I think there's a limit to what he can do, but they were trying to make mischief. The Chinese, I don't think, will get too involved in all this. That's not the politics they're playing at the moment. But I mean, there's negotiating plots everywhere. The main thing is to try to get Greece back to democratic and sensible and solvent order, and that does require big structural reforms. They used to have 580 occupations in which you could retire with your full pension in your 50s. Now, Greek governments can't pay for that. Other governments aren't going to pay for that. I don't mind firemen, although it's far too young for firemen to retire on full pensions. But why are hairdressers allowed to retire on full pension in their 50s? I mean, there are big structural reforms to go on in Greece.
These are some of the things that put the backs up of other European citizens.
Why should other people keep paying for them? They're bailed out twice.
In a moment, I'm going to introduce and welcome to the programme Lord Kerr, who, as you know, is a former head of the diplomatic service, was our man in Brussels. But just to open that phase of the chat, How do you feel about the idea, as David Cameron gets ready to sit down with other European leaders and start the game of renegotiating Britain's place in Europe, in the shape of Europe itself, the way that it administers and runs itself? How do you feel about the idea that's being floated in the press over this weekend and by some Conservatives that Britain could become an associate member of the European Union, or some such title, to mark a break with our old relationship and pull out of the goal of ever closer union?
Well, they're all right-wing nationalists. They're the ones that call themselves Eurosceptics. It's the Murdoch press that's wildly excited about all that kind of thing. I mean, I think our membership of the European Union is the way of looking after our interests in the modern world. The question in the referendum is not going to be about the details of negotiations or the title of our membership. It's about whether or not Britain can best look after our own interest in today's world as a leading member of the EU, and whether the right base for our economy and a globalised economy is with full access to this big market, with full influence over what the rules of the market are.
Associate membership, that's all just window dressing for you.
Well,
Is it meaningless?
What on earth does it mean? Unless you just deliberately want to reduce your role in the way in which the European Union is run, despite the fact that we're heavily dependent on our success in the European Union as a country. No, it's the Eurosceptics, as they call themselves, keep spending their time trying to force on David demands which they know are quite incompatible with the European Union. They want us to leave. They don't want reforms.
What about withdrawal from what's called the social chapter? Britain under John Major was aside from that, and then Tony Blair took Britain back in again, and it suggested we could be pulling out again. Would that be a good idea?
Well, I'm not sure what practical effects would nowadays follow, because the Working Time Directive, which I've always been against, I mean, it doesn't have much effect here in Britain. I know Tony gave up our opt-out for the junior doctors, but that's because he was frightened of the BMA. It had nothing to do with Europe. We could probably get the opt-out back so we could restore doctor training properly, if you're prepared to take on the BMA. It's window dressing. There are important reforms that David has set out, but the Eurosceptics aren't interested in those because they know he might get those, ending benefit tourism, but also completing the single market, deregulating.
So you think they're playing an impossibilist game?
Ever since he announced it, they've been trying to manoeuvre him into making demands which they know would wreck the European Union for everybody else and ourselves, because they just have, I think, a rather nostalgic desire to be off out there on our own.
Okay, let's bring in Lord Kerr, as I say, our former ambassador. We call that job permanent representative in Brussels, former head of the diplomatic service. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Good morning to you, John. Before we talk about, we'll get your thoughts on this. I wanted to try and get you on last weekend, but I couldn't because you were at the Bilderberg summit of the Bilderberg Club, where you're on what's called the steering committee. Now, the conspiracy theorists tell us that it's where the most powerful people on earth meet together to secretly run the world.
That's right.
So is there anything you can share with us? Share with us now, or would you have to order us all to be eliminated if we knew?
Actually, I used to go to see Ken. I find Ken incredibly annoying because I always agree with him, which means I can't play Yes Minister and Sir Humphrey, which is my natural part. Of some of the Bilderbergers, of course, are giant lizards. You know that.
I do. Yeah, aliens. Yeah. It's quite scary. Look, on Europe. Do you think, because you were in the nuts and bolts of the diplomatic machine for so many years, do you think Britain has paid a price for demanding new terms on the threat of quitting the European Union? How do you think that's affected Britain's clout in EU meetings, where every day detailed decisions are being taken?
I think we do have slightly less influence now than we used to have. I think that John Major was a very good European negotiator and was very close to Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand and Ruud Lubbers, and I think we have slipped away slightly from that. But I've seen no reason.
At measurable cost. I mean, have we actually lost out? Because a lot of people would say, look, it's right to seek better terms, it's right to, with respect to the British people, to say, look, if we don't like them, we're off.
No, I think that would be completely crazy to say, and I agree with Ken.
But that is what we're saying. If we don't like the terms, we're off.
Well, we're making noises at the start of a negotiation, and this will be quite a long negotiation. I mean, I don't expect a great deal to be achieved at this week's summit meeting.
Why not? Because it's just beginning of position taking.
Yeah, that's right. First, you can't get a negotiation going until it takes place on basis of a bit of paper. And Mr. Cameron, quite rightly, is not saying exactly what he wants until he has some sort of feeling for what he can get. That's a perfectly sensible way to proceed. Yeah. But it means that there can't be detailed negotiation. And secondly, we put ourselves at the centre of the stage, but we're not. This week, the things that are centre stage are Greece. The heads of government are meeting tomorrow, and if they haven't done a deal tomorrow, then they'll be back trying to do a deal later in the week. Ukraine, we have a neighbouring country which is being invaded, which has a war in its territory, and appalling mayhem in the Mediterranean and bodies on Italian beaches. If you're the Italian Prime Minister, if you're an East European Prime Minister, if you're the French Prime Minister, all these things are far more important than the prospect of what sort of deal might be done with the British next year.
You bring in Beth Rigby and Jim Waterson. Beth?
I think that's exactly right. And I think...
Ken Clarke, do you believe that the Prime Minister, that David Cameron, is actually serious about wanting to bring about significant, major change in our relationship with the European Union? Or is this about appeasing, the people you consider troublemakers back home and making as much as possible out of maybe not very much?
It's a bit of both, actually. But I'm glad to say, I think he quite definitely has always wanted us to be members of the European Union. He wants to stay in the European Union. He's been Prime Minister. He knows perfectly well that his role in the international affairs would be diminished if he left. He's seen how the 21st century works. So the idea of leaving, I think he's not in favour of. And actually, he is pressing for some quite serious things. There'll be Germans, there'll be Scandinavians, there'll be Eastern Europeans who think we really ought to liven the European Union up on the economic front, particularly. And we've all got these troubles, and it's ridiculous to keep talking about completing the single market and doing nothing about it. It's ridiculous to talk about deregulation. Now we've got a Vice President Timmermans in the Commission who wants to do it. Member state governments have got to say what they want to deregulate, and all that's fine. So I think he believes that. Now, at the same time, obviously, before the election, he wanted to shut up our sort of hardline right, the nationalists in the party, who thought the whole election was all about Britain's, leaving the European Union and proudly proclaiming that it's on its own in the Atlantic again. And we did shut them up. But now I also agree with what somebody just said. I'm sorry, can't remember which participant it was. You don't go into a negotiation producing a great shopping list at the beginning, which will be instantly denounced by every Eurosceptic as a shameful sellout, whatever he offers. If they're going to pay David Cameron's weight in gold once a year as a tribute, Bill Cash would say that was too we need.
But from what you're saying, Ken,
and he's also got to negotiate something that's in the interests of other members as well, and is of sensible use to Britain in the future. We've got to look to our future role in the world, how we get back to being a big, successful economic player in a globalised economy.
But from what you're saying about, in your view, David Cameron's fundamental belief that Britain's future is in the European Union, he does not want to be the Prime Minister that breaks that chain. Does that mean, in your view, that David Cameron, whatever comes out of these negotiations, however big or small, he'll present those as a triumph and say, let's all vote for that because it's a great deal?
Well, I think he can get things out of these negotiations. And
but that's where he's
will.
Starting with the clear intention of doing that.
As I began by saying, I think, the British media, and not, of course, this programme, but the British media are making the whole thing seem as though it's about these negotiations. If you look at the question in the bill which is before the House of Commons, it's about, where do you want Britain to be in the days of your children and your grandchildren? And are we best placed as continuing as a member of the European Union, or are we, best placed outside, seeing what kind of trading relationship we can get without having any influence on the rules of the trading of the market there anymore. And that's what the question's about. It won't be about how many years does it take a Lithuanian to qualify for benefit here. That is not what the referendum is about.
Let me just get John Kerr's thoughts in just a second. But this is Maria texting in from Bradford. She says, in answer to what you were saying earlier on, the Greek people can vote for whoever they like. The issue here is that Greece was pushed into the euro by the deluded Europhiles when Greece was not ready. Doesn't Maria in Bradford have a point? Ken. I mean, there was a project here. The euro currency project was bound into the political project. It was all about delivering and getting a closer union. And blind eyes were turned all over the place over years to the fact that countries like Greece were not actually qualifying to be a member of a single European currency.
Well, I was one of the finance ministers who helped negotiate the details of the single currency, helped by John Kerr, I might say, very much so. And I've always thought, I say to my colleagues former colleagues on the Europe, what on earth did you let the Greeks in for? One of the things, it wasn't in the interests of Greece, as sadly it's turned out, any more than it was of the other Eurozone countries. If you think back to those,
But it was a kind of a plan. It was a scheme by Europhiles. And
no, it was a Greek government that decided it was the interests of the Greek government of the day to try to demonstrate to their electorate how successful they'd been in making Greece a bigger country, and rather fiddled the figures they presented on their deficit in order to get into the euro.
And as I say, blind eyes were turned by the authorities.
Blind eyes were not for some sort of great Europhile plotting reasons, but because democratic politicians all were tempted to start buying votes, and they kind of helped out the Greek Prime Minister by agreeing to it. And when I was the finance minister negotiating the details from the British point of view with powerful finance ministers from the countries now in the Eurozone, we had a whole set of rules about which, how you qualified to join. You've got to have economies that can live with each other. Competitive economies can live with the German economy. And the Greeks, and with respect, although they're doing wonders turning themselves around, the Portuguese, for example, in my opinion, were never ready. And I used to say so privately at things like Bilderberg meetings. When it happened, I couldn't understand why our successors were allowing this kind of thing to happen.
John Kerr.
As usual, I agree with Ken. God, he is boring and he's always right. I do think,
you didn't
John,
used to say that all the time.
That you used to, that you need to be careful about a category of countries like Greece. The reason why Mr. Tsipras has been unable to persuade his colleagues in the European Council to let the Greeks off the hook is that the Italians and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Irish have taken their medicine and have come through, and he owes them large sums of money. And they do not want to let him off the hook. There isn't a category, Southern Europe, that is being persecuted by evil Germans and Finns and Dutch. It's the Greeks against the rest. I very much hope that a deal is done, because if a deal isn't done, it's lose-lose. The Greeks get more austerity and economic chaos, and the creditors don't get their money back, and they don't get structural reform in Greece. So it would be far better if a deal is struck this week, but I'm not sure it's going to be, because not everybody is behaving very logically.
Jim Waters.
Yeah, I think it'll come down to a gut instinct, and I think people's polling on this, although we don't really trust opinion polling these days, will shift wildly in the final few weeks as people actually face up to it. Whereas at the moment,
the last poll that I saw was pretty heavily in favour of continued membership. Even now, I've got to move on there. I'd love to carry on, but I can't. Lord Kerr, thanks for coming in. Ken Clarke, thanks for joining us. Right now, I've got to leave it there. This is Pienaar's Politics. Much more to come.